So the task this time was to import the third CSV example file in our project environment and to specify explicitly the column types of the data file to be imported. So as always, we should start with the function here IAM to specify the name of our R script, in this case import data 3. It's located in R, it's called import data 3. We should attach the packages that we're about to use, as always, the here package, the data table package, and the table package. And then the next step is to specify the data path using the function here. In our case, that's data, raw, and then now the third CSV file that we're about to use. And now, we can start the same way as the times before and see where that leads us. So we use the from the data table package, we use fread, and let's just start by importing the file using the default settings and see where this leads us. First of all, this looks a little bit confusing because we have now a bigger data set. It has 2,484 rows, so that's not as straightforward to read as before. And then we look at it and we see immediately, okay, there's a column called commodity code. So at least this should catch our attention. To be vigilant, because whenever there's some mentioning of code or index or so on, we should make sure that this is actually encoded the right way in R. And in our case here, the thing that we only see 3 digits should make us suspicious. So one thing we can do is to navigate here to the raw data file, click on View File. As I said, this is not a problem in our case, but if we are working with very big data sets, so this number here is very large, we should be careful because our computer might get stuck. In our case, however, we can click here and we see that our suspicion was correct. Commodity code here is actually a 4-digit code, not a 3-digit code as this column here might make us believe. So this should be adjusted. As I said, if the data set is very large, we could get a preview of it by using the optional argument nrows. So for example, nrows equals 4 only reads in the first 4 rows. And this makes it much more easier to see. If the data set is very large, it also doesn't take too much time. So what we can do here is we can use the optional argument call classes to be specific with regard to the object type these columns should be encoded. And this way we could also address the other part of the exercise, namely to make sure that the C group column here is encoded as a factor. So in this case, we now need to create a column. We need to create a vector of characters, 1 character for each column. So the first column, C group, that should be stored as factor. The second column, commodity code, should be encoded as character. And then we have 2 columns that should be encoded as double. So we can use the wrap function here. Could also make this here a little bit clearer by using line breaks. And then see, okay, where this leads us. So here we see, okay, that actually has worked. First column C group encoded as factor, second as character. Now the first leading 0 is preserved and the other 2 columns stored as double vectors. So let's use a name, here data set 3. And we can also make sure this data set 3 is stored as a tibble. Now, be careful if you do this. You might wonder doesn't usually the tibble print the first 5 rows, and why is it only a 4 times 4 tibble? Because the data set is much larger. Here, the nrows argument is still operational here. So we need to remove that, because the nrows argument is something we only usually do when we in this trial and error phase of importing the data set and to just look at what we have imported. Then we only usually need the first 3 or 4 rows to infer what's actually going on. But if we now want to process this data set further, it would be important to have actually the complete data set imported. So we should remove that optional argument. If we now execute everything, we now see, okay, we have here a table with all the rows, and this is also visible because the first 10 rows are printed and there are more rows that are omitted. So this would be, we could also use here then the function head to only see the first couple of rows. So this here would be sufficient actually to solve the exercise. We now imported this data set into R. Everything seems to work correctly. We also addressed this challenge of getting the commodity codes correctly specified or encoded as character vectors. And as this has been different in the sense to the previous examples, that this might be an importing error that you do not spot immediately. Especially the commodity codes here in the beginning were ones that didn't have a leading 0. So you really need to be careful, and whenever you import data into R, you need to inspect it using the head function or the str function. You need to inspect it, and you need to make sure that the data has been imported correctly and there were no mistakes, such as, for example, the falsely encoded commodity codes. To this end, you need to look at the raw data, you need to read about the raw data, you need to know your raw data, you need to be sure how the data set is meant to look like, so that you can actually choose the right optional argument for data table fread, so that you get the result you actually need. Just want to give you one optional input here, namely the how to use the select subset. As I said, here, let's say, okay, we look at the data set again. Okay, we see we do want to change something with regard to C group and commodity code, but assume we only want to keep the product complexity and not the export share. So we only want to read in a subset of all the columns. Then we could use this optional argument select. And select is usually used in the sense that you just provide a vector with the names of the columns that you actually want to read in. So in our case, here it's probably easiest if we just copy paste the names of the columns to avoid typos. Now if we use that, we see that only these 3 columns mentioned here are imported. But we can also combine the select input to also provide the column types for these. So we could use a name vector here and say, okay, C group should be a factor, commodity code should be a character, and product complexity should be a double. Again, we could use line breaks to make it easier visible. If we execute this, we now see that only the 3 columns are imported, but they are also used with the correct coding scheme. So we could now here take a new name, replace everything here, and verify this code actually works as well. Yeah? So this select argument is a very useful option if you only want to import the subset of the data set with regard to the columns, just as the nrows argument is useful to get a first view on a subset of the data set. This becomes relevant, especially when you work with very, very big data sets. But in the first step, just to solve this exercise, this code here would have been sufficient. Nevertheless, I hope the rest was somehow interesting as well.